What's up, Rovers? It's been weeks since we've met Aemeath, and I hope you've enjoyed 3.1's story. In fact, I heard Aemeath was Kuro's highest selling banner of all time. She's definitely worth it. Today's video will cover everything we've learned since her release, including alt tech, teams, gearing, and mechanics. Aemeath is our newest Fusion DPS, letting you choose between Toon Rupture or FusionBurst mode specialties, which also dictate her team building options. In fact, Aemeath is unique in having the most flexible options of any DPS in the game, with all being meta viable and top of the list. Today's guide has taken over 100 hours to make. If you found this video helpful, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. Aemeath's team building guide will be released separately after her FusionBurst SubDPS unit comes out, due to the massive list of options she has available and significantly different playstyles between non-swap and quick swap. This guide will still mention her best teammates and how the teams play, but nuances on gearing and rotations will be found in her spreadsheets. These are listed in the description and pinned. We'll cover Aemeath's team role and main mechanics first, then the typical deeper dive. Forte Priorities come after, and then echo stuff, Mainstats, Substats, and I know some of you will be wondering about how much better her new Trailblazing star set is over Molten Rift or Flaming Clawprint. Then we have weapon comparisons, endgame stat goals, and her sequences breakdown. We'll end with her rotations and a short summary of her team setups. Let's dive right in. Aemeath is our newest Fusion main DPS that is capable of both aerial and ground combat. While her human form is strictly grounded, the mech form can use its entire moveset so long as it is near the ground. The bulk of her moves are basics and enhanced normal skills to charge her Forte bar, casting her normal skill swaps between forms. The later parts of her basic chains are very quick swap friendly, and her normal skill also gains a special attack if used after at least basic 2, producing more Forte than her basic chains but slower to cast. This makes her enhanced skills amazing for quick swap but rather average for non-swap play. In general, her basics and normal or enhanced skills are quite weak, but if at least one Forte segment is full and she completes a full basic chain, you can cast her Forte skill Cutscene instead, which deals damage and extra Toon Rupture or FusionBurst damage depending on her resonance mode you picked on her Forte screen. Casting her first liberation or her Forte skills gives stars above her Forte bar. Importantly, casting her first liberation after her intro will grant 2 stars instead of 1. Reaching 4 stars after casting First Liberation allows you to cast a stronger heavy attack before launching her iconic Second Liberation Exostrider nuke. Aemeath's kit grants major self buffs depending on the number of Toon Rupture or FusionBurst resonators on her team, but these are not mandatory due to external team buffs from resonators, which we will discuss later. Aemeath is roughly 60% Liberation typing, with 20 to 30% of her damage output coming from Toon Rupture or FusionBurst. Aemeath has relatively high baseline scaling even on a bad build, since Toon Rupture and FusionBurst only care about your resonator level and ignore attack, crits, damage percent, or amplify buffs. Conversely, a good Aemeath build gains less damage than expected because substats only affect up to 3/4 of her baseline output. Aemeath is an above average energy producer and grants even more energy in quick swap comps due to extra uses of her enhanced skill, which provides more energy than her basic attacks. Therefore, 115 to 120 ER is enough for her. 110 can work in quick swap but is not recommended. Trailblazing Star, her new echo set, is roughly 8% better than Molten Rift and Flaming Clawprint. It also gives her crit rate and is recommended to farm since her big ult nuke is only a single hit, and the echo being a summon instead of Molten Rift's transformative 4 costs. But now I will assume you have a baseline understanding of Toon Break itself. It was added in version 3.0 Lahai-Roi, available to all resonators in the game, where hitting enemies enough will make them enter a mistuned status with a shattered glass effect on their HP bar. Bosses have a separate shield icon to the left of their health. Reaching the mistuned state plays a cracked glass sound. Bosses and elites require you to manually press F or interact on them to cast Toon Break, whereas trash mobs or any enemy in Whimpering Waste will Toon Break automatically on the next hit. Mistuned state lasts a very long time and has zero impact on enemy behavior until you execute the Toon Break. Some bosses will put a free 2 to 3 seconds Toon Break window on themselves right before using very annoying moves. Casting Toon Break interrupts your current action to perform a finisher on the enemy. This will also interrupt their action and 99% of the time resets the enemy to an idle state. Pick the right moment that works for you and the enemy. 3.x Resonators permanently have 10 Toon Break boost points base, whereas all pre-3.x Resonators have 0, aka 3.x Resonators Toon Break for 10% higher damage as a baseline. The exact description of Toon Break skills can be found beside your outro on the Forte tree. 3.x Resonators have unique passives that trigger on Toon Break as well. Aemeath is one of them, granting her extra effects if she's in Toon Rupture mode. Her other mode, FusionBurst, has unrelated benefits. Aemeath has a toggle at the top left of her Forte skills page to pick Toon Rupture or FusionBurst resonance modes. They do not change how her rotation works and only affect how the bonus damage of her Forte skill is calculated, and if she does bonus damage during a Toon Break cast by the team. It also determines if her intro skills and basic attacks or normal skills will inflict Toon Rupture shifting or FusionBurst stacks. Both modes are roughly comparable, but Toon Rupture will seem stronger because it is currently shielded more, and her full premium Toon Rupture team already exists, whereas her dedicated FusionBurst sub-DPS has not released yet at the time of this video. FusionBurst is expected to excel in AoE content like Whimpering Wastes. For Toon Rupture mode, Aemeath now automatically applies Toon Rupture shifting to any enemy she hits with her intros, basic 3 or 4 in either form, or enhanced skill variants. Anytime anyone on the team casts Toon Break on an enemy with Toon Rupture shifting, it upgrades to an interfered state and causes Aemeath to apply an off-field extra fusion hit at the same time as the Toon Break. This damage only scales off of Aemeath's level, but is affected by enemy defense, level, and fusion resistances or special stage or token modifiers, as well as obviously the skill level itself. Toon Break damage hits 4.66 times harder against bosses and has an AoE that will hit all mistuned enemies in range. Aemeath will also apply 10 stacks of Rupturous Trail to the enemy, multiplied by the number of Toon Rupture mode Resonators are on the team. This increases the damage of the additional Toon Rupture hits during her Forte skill. Toon Rupture itself is great against a couple of elites or bossing like in TOA and Double Pawn's Matrix. Conversely, it sucks against trash fodder such as Whimpering Wastes, because they either die too fast or only some of them are mistuned, meaning not all of them will get hit by the Toon Break AoE. Additionally, casting her Forte skill will forcefully deal 5 instances of Toon Rupture against randomly chosen targets, on top of the actual Forte skill's damage. This is increased to 10 hits if casted after using Liberation 1. It is also multiplied by the amount of Rupture's Trail stacks on the enemy's hit, with each stack giving 4% extra base scaling. A full 30 stacks grants 120% extra Toon Rupture scaling from her Forte skill. The targets will still trigger an AoE per hit, tagging other enemies within range regardless of if they are in a mistuned state. This makes it decent in AoE content like Whimpering Wastes, unlike her Toon Break Rupture response. The Forte skill's Toon Rupture scaling is calculated with a lower baseline motion value than Aemeath's Toon Break Rupture response, but remember, this value hits 5 to 10 times. It still only scales off of her level. For FusionBurst mode, Aemeath now automatically applies FusionBurst to any enemy she hits with her intros, basic 3 or 4 in either form, or enhanced skill variants. Whenever an enemy reaches maximum FusionBurst stacks, 10 by default, they trigger an AoE explosion that deals damage based off of the max cap. It does not care about your stacks and has its own baseline motion value. Aemeath's unique passive makes enemies explode with the damage of current maximum stacks, 10 by default, once they reach 5 or more stacks instead. She also makes enemies automatically have at least 1 stack of FusionBurst at all times when she's on the team. She will also inflict 1 stack of Fusion Trail per instance of FusionBurst applied to the enemy by anyone on the team. This increases the damage of the additional FusionBurst hits during her Forte skill. FusionBurst is great in AoE content because it deals AoE damage around the target, allowing for a quadratic scaling when multiple enemies are in close proximity to each other. FusionBurst itself sucks at bossing because there's only one enemy to build stacks on, and it inherently has weaker scaling than Toon Rupture. Additionally, casting her Forte skill will forcefully deal one instance of FusionBurst against all targets in range based off of the max cap, without removing any active FusionBurst stacks. Note that units like Chisa or a FusionBurst teammate can increase this max cap. Higher cap equals higher damage on explosion. The baseline scaling of FusionBurst triggered by Forte skill is increased by 200% if casted after using Liberation 1. It is also multiplied by the amount of Fusion Trail stacks on the enemy's hit, with each stack giving 10% extra base scaling. Aemeath can grant a plus 500% extra scaling to FusionBurst triggered by her Forte skill alone. This special FusionBurst instance will still deal AoE damage on each enemy, meaning they can still hit each other with quadratic scaling when in close proximity, and is amazing in content like Whimpering Wastes. Aemeath's kit itself grants up to 60% crit damage to her entire output, and a 25% amplify buff to her big Liberation 2 nuke based off of the amount of Toon Rupture or FusionBurst units on the team matching her resonance mode. The buffs max out at 3 Toon Rupture units or 2 FusionBurst units, and Aemeath always counts as one of them. Her mode is determined by what kind of teammates you will run with her. If you build a Toon Rupture team, you will always pick Toon Rupture mode. If you build a FusionBurst team, you will always pick FusionBurst mode. Otherwise, you don't get the full inherent skill buff. But what if you aren't building a full Toon Rupture team, or you don't have another FusionBurst unit? Great question. Follow this diagram if building a hybrid Aemeath team. Now, if Lynae is on the team, or 2 Toon Rupture units are present but not Chisa, then pick Toon Rupture mode. If no other Toon Rupture units, or Chisa is on the team but not Lynae, then pick FusionBurst mode. Now let's look at the Forte Priorities next. Your biggest priority should be reaching her second inherent skill. Yes, her first inherent skill is a nice bump and worth about 50 to 100k extra damage at S0, or about a 5 to 6% personal DPS increase. But the second inherent skill is where the money is. It grants up to 60% extra crit damage to her permanently after trigger, until loading between zones, changing teams, or changing her resonance mode. You get 20% crit damage per Toon Rupture shifting or Toon Rupture damage inflicted by a unique team member while Aemeath is in Toon Rupture mode, or 30% crit damage per FusionBurst inflicted by a unique team member while Aemeath is in FusionBurst mode. This is worth about 14% more personal DPS when maxed out to 60% crit damage. Also, when reaching 60% crit damage, her Liberation 2 nuke will receive an extra 25% amplify buff, diluted by incoming other amplify buffs, but this is still typically worth at least 5% more personal DPS, even if diluted by the team, putting the value of her inherent skill 2 alone at 20% DPS gain for herself. Remember how I said Aemeath's basic attacks and normal skills are quite weak? Yes, that means we can focus on her Liberation and Forte circuit trees. Liberation is by far the bulk of her output, including both her Lib 1 and Lib 2 bigger nukes. These make up about 35 to 40% of her baseline output and should be leveled to 10. Her Forte circuit includes both the baseline scaling of her Forte skill and the forced extra Toon Rupture or FusionBurst hits, which make up another 35 to 40% of her baseline output. But in full teams, more buffs apply to her Liberation damage and will easily overtake her Toon Rupture or FusionBurst scaling. Regardless, it is still worth leveling this tree to 10. Her basic and skill trees contain the basic attacks of her human and mech forms, respectively. It also contains her normal and enhanced skill form swaps. All of these combined make up only about 10% of her total output, and thus can be left at level 6 or 8. Her intro does almost no damage and can be left at 6. Now, Aemeath has 2 Forte bars, being an ordinary one, Synchronization rate, and the 4 stars above it, Resonance rate. Moving forward, I will refer to her Sync bar as her Forte bar, and Resonance rate bar as stars. Now, it takes 200 points to fully fill her Forte bar, with each segment holding 100 points. Her Forte bar can be filled with basic attacks in either human or mech form, your normal skill, or enhanced skill to swap forms. Enhanced skill can only be casted after at least basic 2, or heavy, or dodge counter in either form, and will trigger a special Sync Strike attack while swapping to the opposite form. Sync Strike is extremely good for quick swaps because it produces more Forte than any basic except basic 4. It also directly continues from basic 2 of the opposite form if you continue attacking or swap back in time, as Sync Strike itself is somewhat slow, being 84 or 92 frames, which is about 1.5 seconds. Forte skill is unlocked for 5 seconds from the moment basic 4 of either form begins, so long as at least one full Forte segment, 100 points, is filled. Yes, you can reach basic 4 first and not have a full segment, then fill it within the next 5 seconds and still cast your Forte skill. Now, tune breaking or applying Fusion Burst with the team will apply corresponding Rupture Trail or Fusion Trail stacks on the enemy. If Aemeath is in the matching resonance mode, these will increase the force Tune Rupture or Fusion Burst damage triggered by her Forte skill. Each time a resonator on team responds to Tune Rupture interfered with their extra hit while Aemeath is in Tune Rupture mode, she will inflict 10 stacks of Rupture Trail, capping at 30 stacks per enemy, with each stack granting 4% extra Tune Rupture base scaling triggered by her Forte skill. Amy herself is capable of responding on a Tune Break with her extra hit if she's in Rupture mode. Each time a resonator on team instead inflicts Fusion Burst on the enemy, while Aemeath is in Fusion Burst mode, she'll inflict 1 stack of Fusion Trail, capping at 30 stacks per enemy, with each stack granting 10% extra Fusion Burst base scaling triggered by her Forte skill. Amy herself can trigger Fusion Burst if she's in Fusion Burst mode, but is slow at doing so. Casting either Forte skill will deal damage and swap to her opposite form. The animation takes roughly 2.5 seconds, but in reality only 1.5 seconds pass on the timer. This means Forte skill has only partial field stop and time stop, which might not seem great, but it also means it can be used as a quick swap window to progress your teammates' rotation during the cast. It will also force 5 Tune Rupture hits, bypassing the mistune requirements on random enemies, with an AoE around the targets, or force 1 Fusion Burst detonation on all targets each, based on max cap Fusion Burst stacks without removing any Fusion Burst stacks, depending on which resonance mode Aemeath is in. Casting Forte skill always grants 1 star, which has no use except for later casting Liberation 2. Casting Liberation 1 also grants 1 star, except if casted within 15 seconds of Amy's intro, it will grant 2 stars instead, aka always cast Liberation 1 after intro, and within 15 seconds to keep her rotation fast. Casting Liberation before Forte skill also increases the forced Tune Rupture or Fusion Burst damage, and is recommended to do so. It either increases the forced Tune Rupture hits from 5 to 10, or increases the base scaling of Fusion Burst triggered by Forte skill by 200%, additive with Fusion Trail's buff. Casting Forte skill also removes all Rupture Trail or Fusion Trail stacks from the enemy, except if you casted Liberation 1 first, aka always cast Forte skill after Liberation 1 to make it deal more damage, and also keep trail stacks around to buff the second Forte cast as well. It is okay to cast Forte skill before Liberation 1 in mono fusion teams, because much less of the team's output will come from Fusion Burst, and helps to speed up slower rotations. Liberation 2 can only be cast after Liberation 1 is already cast first within 60 seconds, and you also reach 4 stars. This will unlock a fast heavy 2 attack that completely skips the charging time and grants plus 200% amplify to itself while fully restoring your entire Forte bar. You barely see it do this, but it's the reason why your Forte bar becomes a funny glowing pink afterwards. Then finally, you can cast the big Lib 2 Exostrider nuke with skill or alt. Doing so removes all Forte and stars afterwards, and has its own 25 seconds cooldown separate from Liberation 1's 25 seconds cooldown. TLDR, build Forte first if you want, then intro and Lib 1, then basic into your Forte skills twice, then special heavy into Liberation 2. Also, she can fly in mech form by pressing T or whatever your utility button is. Move up and down with control and space if you're on keyboard. Direction is controlled with mouse or your joystick. Pressing side directions does barrel rolls, and forward and backward immediately stop her. She cannot fly for very long and needs at least 33% of the bar to do so. Being under this only lets her float above ground, and she needs to be near the ground for the mech to recharge Star Flux slowly. Now, Aemeath's Liberation tree is quite simple. Both are primarily focused around just damage, but her Liberation 1 also has buffs that make her Forte skill hit harder, and make reaching Liberation 2 easier. Lib 1 forces Aemeath into mech form. By default, it grants 1 star, except if casted within 15 seconds of intro, it grants 2 stars instead to speed up her rotation. It also increases the forced 2 Rupture hits of her Forte skill from 5 to 10, or increases the forced Fusion Burst hits of her Forte skill by plus 200% baseline scaling additive to the Fusion Trail buff. It also makes the next Forte skill not consume trail stacks, allowing both Forte skill casts found in a normal rotation to be buffed by Rupturous or Fusion Trail instead of just one of them. Liberation 2 can only be casted within 60 seconds of Lib 1, but also requires 4 stars. This unlocks a special Heavy 2 with instant charge and extra damage, which then finally unlocks Liberation 2. Your big nuke is the strongest single hit in the game with a ridiculous AoE and resets her Forte bar and stars after, with a 25 seconds cooldown separate from Liberation 1's 25 seconds cooldown. Now, while weak, Aemeath's skill and basic trees are extremely important to building her Forte bar. The basic tree contains all of her human form basic attacks, heavies, aerials, and dodge counters, while her skill tree contains all of her mech form basic attacks, heavies, aerials, and dodge counters. Skill tree also includes the form switch, which swaps form instantly, and uses basic 1, but is only available at idle or after basic 1. Otherwise, you cast enhanced skill for Sync Strike if you reach at least basic 2, heavy, or dodge counter. This move deals damage and swaps to the opposite form beginning at basic 2. Swap-ins and casting Liberation will start her from basic 2. Casting intro, dodge counter, or tune break starts from basic 3 instead. Because Aemeath charges Forte fastest with the later hits in her basic chain, this helps speed up her rotation a lot. Sync Strike is somewhat slow, taking 1.5 seconds to swap forms and attack, but builds about as much Forte as Basic 4, and is an amazing quick swap tool for charging her Forte at the same time as another Resonator. Mech form has good quick swap windows on Mech Basic 3 and 4, whereas human form only has good quick swap windows on Basic 4. Mech basics can be cast in air slightly off the ground and is preferred for aerial quick swaps, whereas human basics can only be cast on the ground. The very first frame of Basic 4 grants you access to Forte skill for 5 seconds, castable only if at least one Forte segment is filled. The active frames of heavy attack on Aemeath after charging stage 1 or stage 2 are faster in mech form than human form, and is always preferred as well due to larger hitbox with Pierce. The mech's laser comes out quickly in a single hit, whereas human form slashes in an AoE with a delayed final hit, carrying 80% of the move's motion value. This also means instant response is faster with Heavy 2 in mech form before Lib 2. None of her basic attacks will continue to deal damage or produce Forte if animation cancelled, except the final explosion after the swing of Mech Basic 4. Therefore, Aemeath has almost zero animation cancels besides using Forte skill as soon as Basic 4 starts, but has tons of quick swap opportunities. For some reason, perfect dodges are slower in Mech form. Aemeath has 2 intros, one for each form she's in, but fundamentally they are identical in animation length, as each takes 82 frames or almost 1.5 seconds. Both will then proceed into Basic 3 of the matching form. Human form has a faster Basic 3, meaning you can reach Forte skill sooner by introing as human. Mech form can instead skip the end of Basic 4 after the swing and still generate Forte while casting Forte skill, with Mech Basic 3 also producing slightly more Forte than human Basic 3. Generally, generally, it shouldn't really matter much which form you intro as unless you're speedrunning and picking a particular form for the fractional second advantage. Both intros grant Aemeath the Starloom acceleration buff for 15 seconds, which allows her Liberation 1 to grant 2 stars instead of 1. Amy's outro appears to have 2 variants, but in reality, she just grants 10% all damage amp to the entire team for 20 seconds, and 20% instead to Toon Rupture or FusionBurst teammates matching her current resonance mode chosen. She can refresh this buff if she outros again within 20 seconds, pretty good in general, since Amy is usually not played with a pure healer, unless Mornye, but even Mornye deals notably more damage than Shorekeeper. For inherent skills, it's all about damage. You really want her second one, but the first one, Before All Sounds, is a simple 200% damage amp to her enhanced heavy right before her second liberation, the one that skips the charge time and does a ton of damage. Yeah, it's because of this inherent skill it hits that hard. This is worth about a 5 to 6% DPS increase on her, but the real deal is Between the Stars, her second inherent skill. It grants up to 60% crit damage based off the number of Toon Rupture or FusionBurst resonators on team, matching Amy's chosen resonance mode. Each resonator can only count once for this effect. You can see our choice up here if you don't remember the icons. Maxing this out requires 3 Toon Rupture or 2 FusionBurst resonators. Remember that Amy always counts as one of them. If you reach the full 60% crit damage, your second liberation will also gain an extra 25% amplifying the new kit. The buff lasts until you hit a loading screen for zones, swap teammates, or change her resonance mode. This second inherent skill is worth about a 20% DPS on her and should be your first priority get when building her. Echo set discussion time? You really should only be using Trailblazing Star on Aemeath. It procs on both Toon Rupture shifting or FusionBurst, so she can always activate it regardless of resonance mode. It's also roughly 8% better than Molten Rift or Flaming Clawprint and uses a Summon Echo instead of Transform. You're trading away 10% fusion damage bonus for 20% crit rate, which is super important for consistency of her second liberation single hit nuke, and this is just better damage all around. The 25% fusion plus 20% lib of Clawprint is roughly equal to Molten Rift's 40% fusion, and your average Aemeath will be around 73 to 75% crit rate easily, meaning she reaches 93 to 95% crit rate in combat. Good builds will be 95 to 100. The only reason why it isn't worth even more is because Toon Rupture and FusionBurst doesn't use her crit stats. Your forecast at Aemeath should be crit damage if the weapon is crit rate, and the forecast should be crit rate if the weapon is crit damage or attack percent. In all cases, Fusion and Fusion Attack are within 1 to 2% of each other, so it doesn't matter which one you choose, go with the one with better substats. It does slightly favor Fusion, but keep in mind most of Amy's teams being slightly more damage percent buffs than attack percent buffs, meaning they'll basically pull even once considered. Even if you're playing Molten Rift, the difference is still only 1 to 2% on these main stats, but it is not advised to use double attack in any setup as it averages a 4 to 5% DPS loss. Note that 44111 on Molten Rift is basically identical to double attack and can function as an easy interim build while you're working on your Trailblazing Star set if you don't have good Fusion 3 costs. Remember that Amy is somewhat insulated from bad Echo builds due to a notable portion of her output coming from Toon Rupture or FusionBurst damage, which doesn't care about your stats. For substats, crit is king as always. Remember that any crit rate out of combat above 80% is wasted if you're using Trailblazing Star. Attack percent is our next best choice, with liberation percent trailing slightly behind. Attack flat is far worse than liberation percent on Amy, though keep in mind all DPS substats are somewhat diluted since at least 1/4 of her output is typically Toon Rupture or FusionBurst damage, which ignores your stats. Amy produces more energy than normal, so 115 to 120 ER is sufficient. Extensive Quickswap allows her to drop to 110 ER, but is not advised. Because Amy is our first liberation scaling DPS and almost all of the rest of her damage comes from Toon Rupture or FusionBurst, most 5-star sword passives do almost nothing for her. This means all 5-star signature weapons except her own perform very similarly to Emerald of Genesis. In fact, Emerald Genesis is usually ahead of them because it both grants attack percent and also an ER substat as passive, which should be converted to an extra DPS sub treated as attack percent here when farming for her build. This means it's basically just her signature, Everbright Polestar, compared to all other 5-star swords being the same. ER swords like Brant, as well as the new 5-star standard Laser Shearer, suck on her and are not advised. While weapons cannot buff her FusionBurst or Tune Rupture damage, muting their effects, her signature gets around this somewhat by offering Liberation Damage Defense Ignore and Liberation Damage Fusion Res Ignore. It doesn't affect FusionBurst or Tune Rupture, but these are rarely diluted by team buffs and thus retains more value in all situations. I have Everbright benchmarked at just 14% improvement over Emerald of Genesis, being modest. This is a smaller gain than most sources report, with one caveat. I'm using a single Quadswap benchmark for Aemeath's rotation. This is extremely important because not only does it make her rotation slightly faster and is easy to play, but it also allows Emerald of Genesis to permanently upkeep its attack percent passive instead of needing to restart with 0 stacks every rotation. This cuts Everbright's DPS advantage by about 2 to 3%, aka a single Quadswap automatically improves Aemeath's DPS with EOG by 2 to 3% because the buff now stays forever. Teammates diluting the attack buff or playing a 110 ER setup benchmark as well will make EOG perform even worse, shifting it another 3%, getting close to a 20% gap between signature and EOG you might be more familiar with seeing elsewhere. If you're having problems upkeeping EOG's buff after Amy's outro, instead tap forward after Lib 2 while casting basic 2-3 into skill before outro, or just mash skill before outro. All other 5-star signatures with crit main stats and buffing damage percent are generally only as good as Emerald of Genesis. Red Spring buffs basic percent, but that's only about 10% of Amy's total output. At least at R5 it's comparable to R5 VOG at 3% improvement, but this is still scuff. For Emerald Sentence and Blazing Brilliance, they buff echo damage and skill damage, of which Amy does nearly none. They are the worst 5-star crit stick options you could choose, but are still roughly comparable to R1 Emerald of Genesis regardless of their refinement. The new 5-star standard weapon, Laser Shearer, sucks on Aemeath. Do not put it on her, it is worse than some 4-star weapons at just 91 to 93% scaling of R1 EOG because it gives ER main stat, which she doesn't care about, and skill percent, but only if the team does Tune Strain, which she can't do and also doesn't care about. For 4-star weapons, Aemeath's options open up a fair bit. Feather Edge, the new BP weapon, is pretty good on her, but only at R5 to take advantage of its passive granting both attack percent and liberation percent, her two most desired stats after crit. It requires Liberation to proc, but Lib 1 is usually the first big damage move she uses anyway, so that's fine. The reason it benchmarks 95% at R5 is because BP weapons have unusual passive scaling, reaching triple value instead of double value at R5. Sumnor Anchor is our next best choice, which fits really well for non-swap Aemeath playstyles because it takes 10 seconds to fully stack its attack percent buff, and Aemeath's damage is backloaded anyways to her nukes. You even get the extra crit rate after 10 seconds just in time for a second liberation nuke, and getting this late doesn't matter because remember, her FusionBurst and Tune Rupture force damage can't crit anyways. This is a free weapon for veteran players and is remarkably good choice for if you have no other 5-star options available. At R5, it's 92% scaling of R1 EOG and 88% when just R1. Fables of Wisdom is the craftable Renacita weapon that grants attack percent on hitting enemies with negative status. This only occurs if playing a FusionBurst team, so keep in mind as R5 parses 91% of R1 EOG, but only with 4 stacks of its passive, whereas it drops to just 84%, which is one of the worst 4-star options at 0 stacks. For Gacha Weapon 4 stars, our classic best bet is the Black Shore series Endless Collapse, a weapon that grants attack percent and energy refund on skill cast. At R5, it gives enough energy that you can drop to 110 to 115 ER, letting you get +1 substat to attack percent, liberation percent, or attack flat. This lets it parse 90% of an R1 EOG. Commando of Conviction is super close, granting a solid amount of attack percent and also parses 90% of R1 EOG when brought to R5, but keep in mind you will still need 115 to 120 ER on Aemeath. Notably below these options are Lunar Cutter for lackluster attack getting to just 87% at R5, and Looming Gloss, the old BP weapon that grants useless basic and heavy percent scaling at just 86% even at R5. Don't use sword number 18 on Amy as it buffs heavy and self-heals, both of which she doesn't really need. Sword of Night is her best 3-star option, reaching 82% scaling at R5. If you manage to achieve all that we've discussed so far, then her endgame substats before any buffs should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Forte, so it can take some time to reach this. Aemeath's sequences do not affect how her rotations play out and are purely damage boosts or removing her team building requirements to satisfy her self buffs. S2 is what turns her Fusion Burst mode into AoE nuke spam and Whimpering Wastes, however it is still reliant on a proper Fusion Burst SubDPS spammer which does not currently exist yet. It also makes her Forte skills, extra Rupture, or Fusion Burst hits do way more damage. Otherwise, S3 is notable for removing her requirements of Rupture or Fusion Burst teams to grant herself the full 60% crit damage and 25% amp on Lib 2. Note that team buffs are still important regardless, but this elevates her Monofusion team to new heights and matching her S3 Premium Toon Rupture or future S3 Premium Fusion Burst team, because now you get the full scaling of Lupa Monofusion with none of the damage losses in Aemeath's kit self buffs. Otherwise, the next stomp is S6, which allows her Toon Rupture and Fusion Burst to crit, most of the time, with fixed stats. It also makes enemies take much more damage from Aemeath and also massively increases her self buff cap from her Rupture's Trail or Fusion Trail stacks. Clearly, the stopping points are S2, S3, and S6. All values are quoted in a vacuum and may be valued differently in full team comps, calculated assuming her signature weapon Everbright Polestar is equipped. Now, Aemeath's first sequence makes her heavy attack during instant response, the state right before her Lib 2 nuke gained plus 300% crit damage, which roughly doubles its output while also grouping enemies together. The grouping is not too noticeable since the hitbox is already pretty big. You also now gain instant response Brilliance, which is the exact same thing with the fast heavy 2 attack if your team is out of combat and have not casted either of her heavy attacks or second liberation nuke in the last 4 seconds. The Brilliance variant refills one full Forte segment on cast and is an easy way to start the fight without quick swaps. Finally, whenever you kill an enemy with Rupturous or Fusion Trail stacks, she will record the highest stack on enemies killed and apply that to the next enemy she hits once. It cannot bypass the current stack cap, by default 30, and can only trigger once per second. This makes her Forte nukes more efficient in Weewa by making sure any enemies she casts on will have enough trail stacks to significantly buff the forced Rupture or Fusion Burst hits or against bosses. S1 is a modest 8% improvement over S0 and mostly focuses on quality of life. S2 makes her Forte skill attacks hit twice as hard. Not the extra Rupture or Fusion Burst hits, the base hits. The Rupture hits instead will gain a plus 20% modifier each time they hit the same enemy. Reliable against bosses, unreliable against waves of mobs like in Weewa. This averages to 1.4 times stronger Rupture hits from Forte skill if 5 hits on same target, and 1.7 times stronger if 10 hits on same target. Fusion Burst instead now receives a plus 300% multiplier buff if Liberation 1 was casted before Forte skill, instead of plus 200% buff before. Fusion Trail now also grants 15% multiplier per stack instead of 10, capping out at plus 450% instead of plus 300. The forced Fusion Burst from Forte's skill can now reach a total of 850% scaling instead of 600 before S2. Finally, Fusion Burst gets a special buff at S2 that's great for Weewa. When enemies die, they now explode with maximum Fusion Burst stacks regardless of current stacks. Remember, this is AoE. With the future Fusion Burst SubDPS spammer and buffer, this will absolutely obliterate Weewa spawns and be our most reliable team there. S2 is 1.36 times as strong as S0 and a 26% increase over S1. S3 is where the biggest nukes are. It doubles the damage of your Liberation 2 Exostrider, easily passing 1 million damage in all 3 team archetypes, Rupture, Fusion Burst, and Monofusion. It also increases your Liberation 1 output by 40%. This nuke usually totals 200 to 300k across 3 hits. Now we'll hit for 300 to 400k. Her instant response Fast Heavy can now also inflict Toon Rupture shifting or Fusion Burst, but this is pretty irrelevant. Most importantly, Aemeath no longer needs 3 Toon Rupture or 2 Fusion Burst units to grant herself the full 60% crit damage and 25% amp on Lib 2. She will just automatically grant it to herself as soon as she starts attacking. This makes the biggest difference for a hybrid teams, especially mono fusion, allowing it to actually fully match your premium Toon Break or FusionBurst comps. Assuming Aemeath already met her self-buffing requirements, S3 is still 1.68 times as strong as S0 and a 24% improvement over S2. If you weren't playing her with 3 Toon Rupture or 2 FusionBurst units, the gain of S3 is much larger. Her S4 is a simple, permanent plus 20% all-attribute damage bonus for the team, similar to most other units, but not locked to attack or a specific element. This results in a modest 1.78 times scaling as S0 and a 6% improvement over S3. S5 is just anti-death. When her HP reaches 0, she becomes the little 2D digital ghost floating above your other characters, and your team gets a 360% attack scaling shield for 5 seconds. Afterwards, she revives with full health and 30 resonance energy, or about a quarter, with the shield removed. This can only trigger once every 10 minutes. The skill issue sequence. It has no impact on her DPS, but ever more comfort, especially if you're fighting holograms. S6 is pretty simple in principle. First, enemies now take 40% more liberation damage from her. This is a unique, undiluted multiplier. Because most of her kit is lib damage anyways, this is a massive boost. She now also applies double the amount of Rupture's Trail or Fusion Trail per hit, but the cap is also raised from 30 to 60, which means the buff cap of the extra Rupture or Fusion Burst hits from her Forte skill are double, aka 240% bonus Rupture scaling and 900% bonus Fusion Burst scaling. Casting Seraphic Duet, her Forte skill now also inflicts 10 stacks of respective Trail stacks matching her Resonance mode, letting her build even outside of Toon Break or Fusion Burst application. Finally, depending on her Resonance mode, her Rupture damage or the team's Fusion Burst damage can now critically hit, with a fixed 80% crit rate and 275% crit damage. This is a pretty ridiculous buff because it is mostly undiluted, and these damage sources already make off at least 1/4 of her output at S0. S6 rates at 3.56 times scaling of S0 and a 99.6% improvement over S5. However, because a large part of the buffs are attributed to Toon Rupture and Fusion Burst damage, which cannot be properly buffed by the team, this portion of her S6 is devalued in full team comps, and S6 can drop all the way down to just 300% scaling only. Now it's time to go over Aemeath's rotations. She has 3 main options, being 0 swap, 1 swap, and 2 swap rotations. 1 swap and 2 swap Aemeath are inherently 1 second faster than 0 swap. This time, the rate she builds synchronization rate will also be shown besides her timer in the rotation table because it is important for quick swap rotations later. Note that today's entire guide is benchmarked around the 1 swap rotation for reasons I'll outline below. Now for 0 swap, this is the most basic option of them all and where you can start learning Aemeath's rotation. You don't need to do anything until she intros. You will skip ahead into Human Form Basics 3, 4. Then cast your Liberation 1 so you can buff your Forte skills later. Cast Mech Basic 2, 3, 4 to build more Forte. Cancel with Toon Break once the sword swings. We don't want to Toon Break until this moment if you're running Mornye as 0, as the observation marker buff only lasts 8 seconds. Otherwise, you can Toon Break earlier whenever you want. Cast your Forte skill next, transforming back into Human. Then cast Human Form Basic 2, 3, 4 again to fill another Forte segment. Cast Forte skill one more time, holding your heavy attack as it ends to automatically fire your Mech Heavy 2. As soon as it hits the enemy, cast Liberation 2 to launch your Exo Strider nuke and Outro to reset. This should only take about 12.5 seconds. Now the 1 swap rotation is the standard I use for all setups. All of Aemeath's teams have at least one good swap window, including your premium Toon Rupture team, being when Lynae intros and casts her normal skill to fill Forte. Here we'll swap to Aemeath to cast basic 2, 3, 4 plus Sync Strike, swapping off as soon as she swaps forms. This already fills over 60% of one segment. The Sync Strike lets us skip the Forte produced by Mech Basic 4 after she intros, letting us immediately Toon Break to proc Mornye's buff the moment the spear starts to rise. We will still have access to our Forte skill, but cast Liberation 1 to buff it first. Then Forte skill once into Human Form for basic 2, 3, 4. You'll have just enough Forte to cast Forte skill a second time. Hold heavy as it ends to automatically fire your Mech Heavy 2, and as soon as that hits the enemy, cast Lib 2 to launch your Exo Strider nuke and Outro to reset. You can optionally cast Skill Form Switch right before Outro or BA2 into skill for Sync Strike instead. This This is sufficient to permanently maintain Emerald of Genesis 2x attack buff stacks. This should only take about 11.5 seconds. 2-swap Aemeath is good for two main reasons. One, it's just as fast as 1-swap Aemeath, being 1 second faster than 0-swap, but it also produces excess Forte to make up for if basic attacks miss the enemy. Additionally, splitting up her one longer swap window into two shorter swap windows allows you to integrate Aemeath's rotation into other Resonators' quick swap windows more smoothly, speeding up overall team rotations even further. The need for 2-swap Aemeath is most apparent in mono fusion teams where frequently Mornye isn't even used and two slower fusion units fill the slots instead. In looped rotations, Aemeath will start the next rotation in mech form, but it doesn't really matter. First rotation she'll be in human form, either way you cast basic 2-3 into Sync Strike and swap off. During a later swap window, you cast BA 2-3 into another Sync Strike and swap off. Basically, you only spent the time needed to cast BA 2-3-2, yet produce nearly 100 Forte already. She will intro into basic 3-4 and cancel the very start of basic 4 with the tune break because we don't need the Forte it gives. Then cast Liberation 1. Immediately cast Forte skill after Lib 1 in all situations. Then cast BA 2-3-4 into another Forte skill. If you weren't using Mornye, you can tune break after first Forte skill and skip ahead to basic 3-4 instead. Since we produce so much Forte, we don't actually need the Forte from human form basic 2. This saves us about 0.7 seconds and cuts the rotation from 11.5 to below 11 seconds. Otherwise, hold heavy as you exit second Forte skill to automatically fire your Mech Heavy 2. Once it hits the enemy, cast Liberation 2 to launch your Exo Strider nuke. Tap forward quickly as it ends to skip the 1 second's end leg while basic attacking to cast basic 2-3 into a Sync Strike and outro to reset, letting you start the next rotation with 24 Forte already. This should only take about 11 to 11.5 seconds. Now, Quadswap Aemeath Opener is primarily used only in speedruns when you can kill in 1 to 2 rotations max. The goal is to front load her Forte skill before intro to cut down on her solo field time, and using the Forte skill partial field time stop and field stop to quick swap with actions on your teammate, such as Brant's Forte skill. This results in minor personal DPR loss, but allows the team to speed up significantly. Casting both Forte skill before Lib 1 also guarantees we get 4th star while in mech form, letting us get the faster Mech Heavy 2 instead of human form slower Heavy 2. Not suitable for if the enemy lives late into Aemeath's second rotation. This showcase demonstrates flexibility in casting Forte skill and that casting it after Lib 1 isn't a hard rule that must be followed in quick swap Aemeath teams. As a reminder, the in-depth version of Aemeath's team building will be in a separate video since it takes an enormous amount of time to get the team data and rotations done. If you want an early peek, I'll already refined all their team rotations in the spreadsheet. Aemeath's main team focus on Toon Ruptures or FusionBurst. However, mono fusion teams with Lupa are barely weaker as well and have various options for the third slot. Finally, hybrid team comps are possible so long as you have one of our meta teammates from the following list: Lynae, Mornye, Lupa, Chisa, Changli, or the future FusionBurst SubDPS. Brant and Galbrena are good slot 3 options as well. Aemeath's best teams are comparable to Cart and Zenny's best teams, but are easier to play. Her other teams are more similar to late 2.x team power scaling. Teams are listed in order of strength. Aemeath's current strongest team, full premium Toon Rupture. This is one of only 2 teams that fully activates Aemeath's 60% crit damage and 25% Lib 2 amp self buffs besides premium FusionBurst, except the FusionBurst SubDPS doesn't exist yet as of version 3.1. This team is thus uncontested currently as the strongest Aemeath team available and is also the strongest 1-2-3 team in the game. She competes with sweaty Cart Chisa quick swap and 3-4 Nightfall Zenny setups, but with much less effort. If you're looking for the best of the best and played with these, this is it. Aemeath's inflated base damage and reliance on Toon Rupture, which does not scale with stats, means she'll be strong even with subpar builds. This also makes her harder to buff, but Lynae brings everything she wants to the table, even being our sole source of Rupture damage buffs. This team also offers minor quick swap options to improve team DPS or open up the door to a 5 ult run and 2-minute content by rushing the first rotation. You can see further details on that on my other video if you click at the top right. Now, the next team does not yet currently exist and includes Aemeath, Chisa, and the future FusionBurst SubDPS. This team is listed at 2 because it is expected to be Aemeath's other main team shilled by the game. This means it should be easy to play and relatively comparable to the premium Toon Rupture team. Where FusionBurst Premium will differ though is their content specialty. Rupture team is expected to scale better for bossing, whereas FusionBurst is expected to scale better for mobbing, like Whimpering Wastes. Rupture damage is more consistent when hitting the same targets over and over again, while letting you choose your Toon Break windows, while FusionBurst is an AoE detonation centered around the target that can hit everything else, similar to the Mech Abomination summoning AoE bombs. Regardless, both teams do both content quite well, with their main competition just really being each other. They aren't bad at the opposite content, but just not the best. It'll be interesting to see how FusionBurst Premium will compete with Forlova Premium in Weewa once the full team releases. Now the next tier of teams are the mono-fusion variants. Lupa Mornye core is actually the weakest mono-fusion Aemeath iteration, but it is ranked highly because it is the only version that requires almost no quickswap to get high performance out of, and is very easy to play for casuals. While most mono-fusion Aemeath teams rank about 5 to 10% weaker than our premium Rupture or FusionBurst teams, the Lupa Mornye version specifically parses at least 10% verse, even with quickswap. With zero swap at all, it is closer to 15% worse. This is offset by the fact that it gives stellar performance even played as 1-2-3, whereas the other mono-fusion variants plummet without quickswap. Keep in mind that being 10 to 15% worse still puts this team at the top end of 2.x teams, only behind Zanny and Kart's sweaty gameplay. Use FusionBurst Aemeath if you're playing this team. Lupa Brant Core is the first of Aemeath's mandatory quickswap teams. The performance of this team hinges on whether you're able to play 1 Anchor Brant or 2 Anchor Brant. If you play 1 Anchor, this team is only roughly comparable to Lupa Mornye Core, but obviously harder to play because you still have to quickswap. However, if you go the 2 Anchor route and can maintain 25 seconds rotations, this team pulls all the way to only about 5% behind Aemeath's intended premium teams, but is very dependent on Brant also having his signature. Otherwise, expected being behind 10% at least instead. 2 Anchor Brant is significantly more difficult to play than 1 Anchor in this team as a warning. Use FusionBurst mode on Aemeath if you're playing this team. To some, Aemeath has brought Changli back into the center of the spotlight. This is one of Aemeath's fastest rotating teams available. The dilemma of Changli comes to what extent the player wants to push quickswap. At its height, this team outputs insane amounts of damage for how short the buff windows are, as how Changli has much less raw damage than 2x Anchor Brant. On the other hand, without quickswap, this team performs quite abysmally, with Lupa providing mismatched outro buffs to Changli, and Aemeath's end rotation nuke missing Changli's outro buffs because they only last 10 seconds. Ideally, fitting enough swap windows allows you to precharge enough of Aemeath's Forte to comfortably fit all of her nukes within Changli's 10 seconds outro buff window, and we minimize Changli's field time to get her massive damage for nearly free. This team is also very front-loaded from Lupa and Changli's early ults, letting you clear early ads quickly, or ending on a strong finish when you loop into the top of a new team rotation. Not for the faint of heart, played properly, this team should get within 5 to 10% of Aemeath's best premium teams. But without quickswap, this team plummets to nearly 20% worse from bad buff management. Use FusionBurst mode on Aemeath if you're playing this team. Lupa Galbrena is the last of the extremely strong mono-fusion teams, but probably has the highest barrier of entry. This team does not work without massive amounts of quickswap, just like 2x Anchor Brant or Changli. However, while Brant has 1x Anchor as an easier option, and Changli is still faster than Galbrena, Galbrena also brings 0 buffs to the table for Aemeath, so this team's performance comes entirely down to how fast you can quickswap consistently. Pure skill is what scales this team, and thus I rank it lower than the other mono-fusion teams due to its complexity and difficulty. This is arguably Aemeath's strongest mono-fusion team and should be able to reach within 5% of her intended premium teams. Expect a well-played Galbrena Aemeath duo to parse more in the 5 to 10% range due to the team's sheer difficulty. Use FusionBurst mode on Aemeath if you're playing this team. The remaining teams in this video are hybrid variants when you lack the teammates to make either of her 2 premium teams or any of the mono-fusion comps. Lupa Lynae still works quite well by virtue of Lynae bringing Aemeath's ideal buffs. However, this team cannot fully satisfy Aemeath's 60% crit damage and 25% lib 2 amp self buffs, and Lupa cannot grant full team buffs either due to Lynae being Spectro. The quick swap windows during Lupa's rotation allow you to comfortably set up Aemeath's Forte in advance. rotate Lupa, Lynae, Aemeath for this team. This team parses 15% worse than Aemeath's premium teams in best case scenario. Quickswap is mandatory due to none of these units being fast. Use Rupture mode on Aemeath if you're playing this team. The next one works quite well due to an interesting quirk. Chisa brings Defense Shred and Ignore to the table even if Aemeath isn't on FusionBurst mode. This affects Aemeath's Toon Rupture damage because it accounts for enemy defense scaling. Thus, Lynae brings Aemeath's ideal buffs, whereas only half of Chisa's kit works but still helps decently even for Amy's wrong resonance mode. Quickswap is mandatory because both SubDPS are slow. Quickswap Amy's Forte and Advance during Chisa's chainsaw attacks. Rotate Chisa into Lynae and Aemeath for this team. This team parses 15% worse than Amy's premium teams in best case scenario. Use Rupture mode on Aemeath if you're playing this team. Next one is Lupa with a flex third slot in Amy team. None of these options are particularly ideal. The best second slot will always be Lynae or the future FusionBurst SubDPS. This means slotting Lupa plus flex results in an even weaker team. Chisa's full kit does work here, but Amy will still lose a lot of damage since she should be on FusionBurst mode in this team. She is the sole FusionBurst unit for herself buff, and there's no way to buff her FusionBurst or Rupture damage besides Chisa's Defense Shred Ignore. Going Mortefi route for Monofusion is also a big downgrade because he does far less damage than any of the remaining premium fusion units, and no one on this team does heavy damage for his outro to buff. Shorekeeper and Verina are notable downgrades over Mornye due to failing the Monofusion requirement for Lupa, providing much less personal damage and also weaker buffs. Remember that part of Shorekeeper's crit rate buffs are also wasted by Amy's super high baseline crit rate when concluding her 5-piece Trailblazing Star plus 20% crit rate buff. Also, her Toon Rupture or FusionBurst damage is unaffected by crit. These teams parse 20 to 25% worse than Amy's premium teams at best. Use FusionBurst mode on Aemeath if you're playing these teams. While Amy is free-to-play friendly weapon-wise, she does not have good free-to-play teammates at all. None of these units buffer well and also have underwhelming damage themselves. Amy will also fail to fully activate her self buffs too. Luckily, Amy's plethora of meta options means only new players will be in this position and can aim to pull any of her better teammates in the near future. Expect to lose a minimum of 25 of team DPS with these free-to-play teams all the way up to 40% depending on your units, build investment, and rotation speed. Use FusionBurst mode on Aemeath if you're playing these teams. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I hope this Aemeath guide has been useful in deciding whether or not to pull on her banner or raid runs. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values and test stuff. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. Don't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this one. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you all next time.